ठीक है, अब मैं गो लाइव करूंगी तो लाइव हो जाएगा. We are live now. We can start.
Fine. Good evening, viewers. Indeed, it is a very privileged opportunity today. I welcome you, those who are already hooked to our this background of education pe Charcha. I welcome all of you from across the world, and those, of course, who are in the just process of joining us. Indeed, I would like to inform all my viewers that education pe Charcha is akin to educating the nation. As you all would appreciate, just yesterday it was Makar Sankranti, one of the very, very auspicious occasions. And today, of course, it happens to be an education pe Charcha. I welcome all of you because we do have today a very, very august academician. In fact, a professor of the political science, and definitely an honorable Bhadralok Bengali face, a gentlemanly face, having been born and brought up in Kolkata, that is the erstwhile Calcutta. I am intrinsically connected with that of Bengali, or that of Bengali culture. And I do recall here at this particular moment that Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had dubbed Calcutta as the intellectual capital city of the nation. But it is my opinion that Calcutta not only happens to be the intellectual capital of the nation, but it is a intellectual citadel of India, and also one of the intellectual citadels of the entire world. So in fact, we are glad today, and it is the 31st session on Education pe Charcha. We welcome an educational jar, Professor Subrata Mukherjee Sahib from Delhi University. Retired, though he is retired, from the academy, from Delhi University, but not from the academia, because he keeps on imparting, or he keeps on, he involves himself very, very intimately and inextricably in all sort of educational, various educational programs. So we welcome you, sir. It is indeed, a bestowal of divine grace that today you are gracing and blessing our education pe Charcha. We do consider you as an educational jar, a man who has so much depth in the political philosophies, right from Plato's Republic to that of Marx, Das Capital. So today it will be a very, very scintillating discussion with one of the experts in the field of unraveling both Plato as well as Marx and Gandhi too. So definitely it is going to be a very, very engrossing and illuminating discussion today on Education pe Charcha. Professor Mukherjee's background, of course, is very, very important. I would just say in nutshell, because most of the illustrious the career graph that he had followed, that his educational trajectory has followed hitherto, will definitely crop up in question answer session. So just in short, Professor Subrata Mukherjee retired as Professor of Political Science, University of Delhi, South Campus, New Delhi. He did his Ph.D. from the Department of Political Science, Indiana University of Bloomington of United States of America. That is a very, very illustrious credential of Professor, that is Subrata Mukherjee Sahib. Sir, I very much welcome you on this August show of Education pe Charcha from Subrata. And viewers, let me inform you, rather reiterate yet again, that this Education pe Charcha is being run on an August platform of Subrata in collaboration with that of B.R. Ambedkar University of Social Science, which is being represented by a very, very revered professor, Dr. Shri Surendra Pathak. Sir, I welcome you for the show, today's show. And it is my first question, sir. Walking down the memory lane, could you enlighten our viewers on your sophomoric days, that is the years, your place of birth, your alma mater, that is school, colleges, etc., etc. Please, sir, we welcome a very, very ex-professor, Dr. Shri Subrata Mukherjee Sahib. Sir, it's your turn now, please.
Thank you for a very generous introduction. I don't know if I deserve it. I am a Delhi-based Bengali. I was born here, and my education, both primary, secondary, college, and university, was all in Delhi. And then I was fortunate to get a scholarship, Fulbright. That's how I went to the United States and completed my study. My essential interests are political theory and comparative politics. And in the making of my career, Professor Frank Thakurdas, who taught me in Kirodimal College, has left a permanent imprint on me. And whatever I have pursued, it is the guideline that he provided. The guideline that he provided, I think, is important for understanding the education process. It is a Socratic dialogue that he emphasized on, and he believed that truth comes out of discussion. Scholarship is universal, and there are certain basic principles of education. And if a nation is to make a mark in the world, it must be first rate in education. Unfortunately, in the context of India, the post-independence educational setup continued to be colonial, and in the context of that, whether it is Kothari Commission or many other commissions, what we find that in the context of the world standard, India's education system has really not matched the possibilities that it had. For instance, if you really look to the world graph, you'll find that in the first 100 universities, there is not a single Indian university. And when we look to the graph a bit more, what we find is that the institutions that are really sought after both in India and is respected outside are all very limited. It's the IITs. The IITs that were set up immediately after independence. First one was at Kharagpur, and Gyan Ghosh played a very crucial role in its establishment, and Nehru supported it. Ultimately, what happened was that the 5 IITs that came up, and then there is a recent expansion, but they are yet to make a mark, because education is one thing where the dividend comes much later. You see, it's a kind of a social capital that you have to build over a process of a period of time with dedication, and you want to make it up to date and competitive, and in the context of what the other countries are doing. So I think when we talk of education in India, we should have 3-4 basic points. One is the post-independence education system and its historical heritage in the colonial period. The second important point is how we plan science and research, because ultimately it's an age of science and scientific research matters the most. Third important point is that a stock taking and how do we improve our education system and really make it valuable both for the country and the world, and also linking it with the employment prospects of the young people, because one great advantage that India has is the generational advantage. It's a young nation, but then the young nation, to be meaningful in the world, must be educated properly, and that's the larger framework under which I think we should discuss the education principles and prospects in the Indian context.
Thanks a lot, sir. And of course, as you have been articulating on this particular question, I just posed to you, just walking down the memory lane, your own, your own presumption, your own observation, where under you have your own conclusions that India, out of 100 best of universities across the world, even IITs are not included. So here, sir, I would just like to seek your opinion that do you think that what Tagore had said, that initially the education should be imparted only through the mother tongue, but after the Macaulay's educational vision got institutionalized in our country, there was a mad frenzy surrounding the English education. So as Tagore's vision was to impart education to our children through their mother tongue, which got somehow vitiated or somehow which got stagnated because of this Macaulay's superimposition has been the root cause behind India's education system not attaining the level of maturity which it ought to have. Your say on this?
Well, if you really look to the Machiavellian endeavor, first let's do our, the heritage that India has in education. It's very interesting point that India was always bilingual. There was a court language, which was Sanskrit to begin with, and then during the Mughal times it became Persian, but there is a Prakrit, a local language. So multilingualism is a part of the Indian educational evolution and also societal evolution. For instance, if you really look to the articulation and development of the Indian languages, except for Tamil, which has a very old heritage, older than Sanskrit even, the other Indian languages, including Bengali, Hindi, originated during the medieval times. And then the official language used to be different, as I told you, that since the modern British educational system inherited the Mughal system and then moved ahead, then it was the Persian. Even today, you'll find a lot of old land deals in Persian in Rajasthan, Punjab, and the other areas of North India. But then what happened was that once there was a decline, and then in 1837, a very important decision that took place was that the court language changed from Persian to English. That was a decisive blunder, and that led to a lot of inconvenience also. But the fact remains that the official language slowly changed from the Persian heritage to the English one. And now subsequently what happened, as you point out, Macaulay's attempt was to create brown sahibs, that the color will be brown, but they'll be thinking like the Britishers. And that was the aim. But then what Macaulay did not realize, that once the Indians will start get educated, they will also hanker for freedom. For instance, by the time you come to the 1850s, not only that there is the first war of India's independence, but there is also an articulation of freedom. For instance, in Bengali, a poem at that time came up was Shadinata Hinataye ke bachite chahe re ke bachite chahe. Who wants to live in this country or the world without freedom? So side by side, what we find is the establishment of the 3 universities. After the rebellion, that's what they called, we call it First War of Independence. And Savarkar was the first man who called it the First War of Independence. And he wrote a book, I think, which all of us should try to read. The 3 important universities came up of the 3 important commercial centers that the Britishers developed. That also meant the Muslim educational centers that came up during the time of the Mughal period were sidelined. One reason of the relative decline of a subsequent a large segment of Indian population was because of the shifts. And the shifts had some very other interesting characters. For instance, since Kolkata, at that time it was Calcutta, was the center of power, the Calcutta University's jurisdiction was unbelievable. It was Rangoon, Visakhapatnam, and Kabul. That was the entire spread of the Calcutta University, and the Bengalis, mainly the educated Hindus, spread all over India, and that's why you'll find that everywhere there is a Kalibadi, because the migration pattern was, since Hindus took advantage of the education most, they really occupied the clerical jobs and the other senior administrative positions that was open to Indians. And Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the establishment of the Aligarh University, was in a way to really uplift the Indians and provide them with the modern education. And Sir Syed used to, I'll just give you two examples of his. He used to be terribly upset that it's the Mukherjees and Chatterjees and Ghoshes. They occupy the senior positions in ICS and the other legal profession. At that time, legal profession was the most important one. To be a barrister was the important thing. That's why I'll find that all the important leaders of the nationalist movement were lawyers. Very few of them were not lawyers, and the non-lawyers really could not make much of a dent in the lawyer-dominated national movement. But in any case, so this is the way the entire thing spread. And then slowly, of course, the other universities came up. I think the Allahabad University came up in 1875 and Patna University came up later. But I'd like to remind you, since you originally come from Bihar, Patna was an illustrious university. And on the Ganges, the science college it had very important contribution to the national development in science and technology. And I'd like to point out that one of the most outstanding political scientists that the post-independence India had produced, V.P. Verma, spent his entire life in Patna. And both in Western political theory and Indian one, he was a master, and you cannot begin the study of either without a reference to V.P. Verma. Like that, how it is developed. I'll also like to point out a very important development, since you brought in Tagore's name, that Ram Mohan Roy, with whom we begin modern Indian political theorizing, and also the study of modern India. And there what we find is that he encouraged English education. And that's how when the Presidency College comes up, it is modeled after the British universities. So was Aligarh later, Syed Ahmad Khan. And the reason for this was in the context of Ram Mohan. Ram Mohan directly wasn't associated with the establishment of Presidency College. It was named Hindu College at the beginning. And there we find that the emphasis on science, the emphasis on reasoning, and the entire idea was to link the Indian society and the reform movement with the Western heritage. There, I think, the philosophers and the thinkers at that time, the other name I should mention will be Henry de Rosio, they all wanted reform of society. Social reform became the primary focal point, and the entire life of Ram Mohan was spent on that. But he also laid the foundation of modern education in India.
Thanks a lot, sir. And my dear viewers, I would like to point out, because our very, very esteemed guest today, he has already given an insight into the, one of the great book, a revolutionary book, that is First War of India's Independence by Shri Veer Savarkar. And, by the grace of divine, I too have had the opportunity of reading the book. And as our esteemed guest, Professor Shri Mukherjee Sahib was telling, I do corroborate it, because in that book, there is a particular context given that after the War of Independence in 1857, so what exactly happened? Basically the British authorities or the government here, I am talking about, even when Her Majesty government took over from East India Company, they started unleashing their persecutions on Muslims, and which resulted in the Muslims, going under the cell, and consequently, the Hindus, the British authorities were comparatively soft towards Hindus, and thereby, as our esteemed guest was saying, Hindus basically started occupying all such bureaucratic top positions, and advancement of Hindus happened, which slowly gradually caused a tremendous sense of resentment among the Muslim intelligentsia class, and that was the trigger behind Sri Syed Ahmad to start, Aligarh University. That was also one of the regions. I think our honored guest definitely would agree with me, because the fact is very much incorporated in the first war of India's independence, one of the finest books ever written on nationalism. And that was the trigger behind Bhagat Singh and so many revolutionaries. Even Gadar movement, means having taken place, having taken a tangible shape, all because of Veer Savarkar's book, that is First War of India's Independence. So it's so nice that you enlightened us on, on such with so much meticulous details on this very, very important question. Now I'm coming to the next question, sir. This is, you did your PhD from the Department of Political Science in that is Indiana University, USA, as a Fulbright Hayes. Could you let us know about your PhD days in USA, throwing adequate light on Fulbright Hayes grantee, as well as just contrasting the two different the atmospherics here, which prevails here in India and which prevails in USA. I'm talking about academic atmospherics. Your say on this, sir.
Well, if you allow me, I'd like to expand about what I said earlier. That is important. You see, when the modernizing process began with the consolidation of the British, the reception of the British was threefold in what is called the Bengal Renaissance. It was Bengal Renaissance because the Britishers consolidated their power first in Bengal. It is not an indigenous development per se, but there were three different reactions. One was the name I mentioned was De Rosio, who wanted to reject wholesale the context of Indian society. The second was Radhakanta Dev, was a social conservative. And there are practical people in this group who wanted to learn English as a skill, but they don't really wanted to liberalize society. And there comes the importance of Ram Mohan, because if you really look to the British, they never interfered with the social life of the Indians, both the Hindus and the Muslims. And that's how it took Ram Mohan Roy for such a long time, even the abolition of Sati, and then the remarriage of the widows, that was Ishwachandra Vidyasagar, that was in the 1850s. So there was no other practical reform. So this is all to be understood, that the British administration was not exactly reformative. It was more a trading nation with the advantages it had with the colonial power. So then you find in Nauroji's and R.C. Dutt's drain theory coming up, that really explains the dialectical nature of British rule, which became one of the starting points of Marx's analysis of India. Now, coming to my own experience, you must have heard a song or a film, Around the World in $8. It's Raj Kapoor's film.
Right.
And he moves around the world in $8. It has a significance of its own, because the foreign exchange that was given at that time was $8. You see, because there was a terrible foreign exchange crisis. India was an emerging nation with import substitution being the most economic policy. And also there was an acute food crisis. So PL 480, if you may remember, that's how the rationing system worked, and everything was regulated, including khoya and rasgullas missing in the summer months. But from that situation of scarcity, I landed up in Bloomington. Fulbright scholarship was a sought after scholarship. It provided for the tuition and all other, named after Senator Fulbright. It was a unique American scholarship system by which people from throughout the world used to go to United States, and scholars from United States also visit different countries, you see, including India. So it's a worldwide program, and I was lucky to get it. I'm not exactly a very bright fellow, but luck was on my side. I got it, and it paid all for my tuition. My wife had a work permit, so that also helped me a bit. But what the most important thing I found out in the American education system is the flexibility. Flexibility with rigor. You can take the courses you like, both in your department. Of course, the core courses you have to take, but some you can also take outside courses, including music and an outside minor, you know. So in a way, it's a comprehensive kind of education with a lot of flexibility, but you have to pass exams. A preliminary examination, which is rather simple, but then there is a qualifying examination that is quite hard, and then you write your thesis and all that. And a very important aspect of the educational system that was very different from ours in the United States was the relative importance that is given not on mugging, not on really expressing the facts, but on interpretation. I remember that in the very first semester of mine, I had a teacher, Alan Ritter, and he told me that I make excellent summary of what is being asked for, but my interpretation is weak. That I think one major thing I learned in the United States, that you have to interpret of our own. But remember, the period I was in USA was a turbulent period of American history. It was the year of Vietnam War that ended. Nixon had to resign, and 4 students of Kent University was killed in anti-Vietnam protest. So in a way, it was a radical period, but then I could see that the relative freedom in the United States is quite good, but there is also a limit to freedom. I remember that the communist leader at that time, quite illustrious, Mukherjee, was denied a visa for visiting the United States. We protested against that as students. There was Allende, who was killed in Chile's military coup. We protested, and then the Palestinian movement was also there, and all these things, the turbulence I passed through. But I must say one thing, I learned a lot, and I'll be failing in my duty and telling you the fact. I had a philosophy teacher called Milton Fisk, who became my lifelong friend, and I learned a lot of reasoning from him, and also the exploitation that also goes on in the richest country of the world. For instance, at that time, there was a yellow wine kind of a protest that was going on in Indiana University, Bloomington campus. And that is because the people who really used to produce those wines were not proper American citizens. So the minimum wage and all that were denied to them. I came across the color problem, the racial problem in the United States. So it was a mixed experience. There was a great deal of adulation I had for the American system, but I also could see the senior side of it. And I could realize that what is important for a country to develop is human resources. And mind you, that if you really look to the subsequent development, the countries which have done quite well, it is the concentration on human resources. You look to Singapore, you look to entire East Asia, you look to China, Japan, all of them have really developed on the basis of concentrating on human resources. And I think that's the way India should also concentrate.
Thanks a lot, sir. And my dear viewers, as our esteemed guest has very correctly, or rather emphatically, he had tried to emphasize upon this very important fact, that is, he alluded to Rajaram Mohan Rai Yeah, of course, that is Ramchandra Guha in his book, The Architect of Modern India. He started tracing the journey of modernity in India right from Rajaram Mohan Rai. My dear viewers, I do recall that when Rajaram Mohan Rai went to United Kingdom, went to England, especially to argue the case for the abolition of Sati Pratha, and just in course of his argument, I think in Privy Council, if I'm not wrong, he tried to impress upon the fact on all the British august parliamentarians and the judicial members that why the abolition of Sati Pratha was so very quintessential part, to be taken care of on a very, very alarming basis. Now, as our esteemed guest has very correctly said, the colonial rulers were least interested in any sort of social reforms. They are only concerned with, with looting our resources, plundering our resources. So the British, the august parliamentarians and judicial members, they all were reluctant. They contended that if we are going to interfere in the Hindu rituals, it would amount to a backlash. So definitely we would not like to interfere in their old age custom. But then Rajaram Mohan Rai's very, very poignant argument, forceful argument that humanity, all the religions are the subsets of the greater set of humanity. And the custom, which is incompatible with that of the tenets of humanity, certainly needs to be nullified. And that very potent argument definitely resonated with all the distinguished parliamentarians and members of judiciary. And finally, Sati Pratha, abolition got the nod. That was a great pioneering contribution from Rajaram Mohan Rai. And as our honored guest says, I recalled his great, his unprecedented contribution to the abolition of one of the most, deadly and most, cursed sort of custom that prevailed in India then. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on the on the academic atmospherics prevailing then in USA, and how so lucidly you contrasted American scenario with that of our own. Thanks a lot. Now, sir, we are coming to a very, very important question, because you are really you epitomize an oceanic depth, in as much as you did a thorough research in writing a very, very important book on Gandhism, Gandhian thought, and Marxist interpretation. So we look forward to learning from you on both these important theories that dominate across the world. Sir, you are the author of Gandhian thought and Marxist interpretation and essays in Marxist theory and practice. Could you kindly differentiate between Marxism and Gandhism, please, sir?
It's not easy. Mashurwala has a book, Gandhi and Marx, that I think you can recommend to your friends and students. You see, Gandhi is quite a complex thinker, you see. And if we are comparing Marx and Gandhi, first we should remember that Marx is in a way continuation of what is called the Western political tradition. You see, the classical period of Western political thought, though I think it will be better to call it political thought, because in ideas there is nothing called Eastern and Western, ends with Hegel. You see, so when Marx came to the scene, he realized that to innovate and to begin afresh is not exactly possible. There is a limit of time in everything, you see. And there he begins with Hegel and tries to comprehend the dialectics and the materialistic interpretation of history. And then, of course, there is a projection of communism that we all know. Now, when we come to Gandhi, the evolution is very different. You see, that he goes to England, that we all know, from a remote corner of Gujarat. He was absolutely apolitical. The only thing that he relishes at that time was a group of vegetarians. And I think the book that influenced him quite a bit at that time was Salt's book, a plea for vegetarianism. And if you are reading a very good book on Gandhi, Mahatma and the Ism, that is Nambudripa's book, you'll find that Nambudripa is castigating Gandhi, he is very critical of Gandhi, that in the 1880s, when so much of radical things are happening in England, like the establishment of the Fabian Society, Hindman Socialist League, anarchistic activities, Gandhi really is not bothered about any one of them. Gandhi's political evolution begins in South Africa in a very different context of racial injustice, and then he comes to India and develops his own. There is a pronounced anti-modernism in Gandhi, in Swaraj, which was published in 1909. The English version was banned by the British. Really gives a projection of what Gandhi really wanted. And even later, Gandhi always defended his position in Hind Swaraj, though by 1919, he could see that the only operational model in India is to be parliamentary democracy. Okay? So that's how he defined Swaraj and all that. Now, coming to the aspect that you are dealing with, Gandhi's projection of education is in the context of Vardha scheme of education. You see, that is a scheme of education that was propounded in the late 30s, and Zakir Hussain propounded it, and many people call it Zakir Hussain model of education. And there he is talking of an educational setup which concentrates more on the basic education and skill development rather than higher education. You see? And a very important aspect of, just one second. I'm sorry. There is one thing that led to a lot of controversies is the skill by providing their labor. And that led to a long debate. And when the Congress governments came up in the states after 1937 election, there was attempts to implement it, but there was a lot of criticism. Muslim League was critical of it, Tagore was critical of it, and the liberals, Sapru, if you may remember the name, was very critical of the entire scheme. So the concentration was on basic education. He supported hereditary profession. A fisherman's son will be a fisherman, that kind of an argument. That was one reason that Tagore opposed it, and the liberals also opposed it because it was a very restrictive kind of education. And later on, when India became independent, it was just forgotten. So if you are really comparing between Marx and Gandhi, there are very few common points. And Gandhi read Marx at the old age of 1943, when he was in Aga Khan Palace in Pune as a prisoner. And then he said that when he was asked the question, he said, I could write it better. And Fisher, the biographer of Gandhi, was quite puzzled by the answer. And as an admirer of Gandhi, Fisher says, probably Gandhi meant this style. You see, the Germans write in a very difficult manner. And Marx was a German, and he wrote in German. And whatever we read are all translations, but then translations are very beautifully done. But the fact is that if you ask me, that Marx and Gandhi are poles apart.
Thanks a lot, sir. And my dear viewers, as our esteemed guest, has thrown adequate light, just distinguishing between Gandhism and Marxism. In course of his beautiful articulation, he referred to E.S. Nambudripad, who I think, if I'm not wrong, was the was the Chief Minister of Kerala, but I don't know whether he was the first Chief Minister or not. But most importantly, actually, being a Bengali in most of the ways, in fact, since my childhood, I have been thoroughly acquainted with communism. Now, most importantly, when I read, I would like to inform my viewers, when I read in My Country, My Life, I think one of the greatest political biographies ever written in the world by Shri Lalkrishna Advaniji, he pointed out a very important and crucial fact, and I was really taken aback. I found it extremely intriguing. When Sri Ranade, who had constructed Vivekananda Rock Memorial, had gone to meet Mr. E.S. Nambudripad just for seeking donation from him, because he went across India after consulting with Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister, and Indira Gandhi said that if such a Vivekananda Rock Memorial is to be constructed on account of private donation, she had no objection to it. And even Indira Gandhi had donated a good amount of money from her personal coffer. But when Ranade Sahab went to meet E.S. Nambudripad, and Advaniji describes in his autobiography that Nambudripad heard the entire contention, or you can say articulation, from Ranade Sahab, but with a stony silence. And finally, he refused to contribute even a single penny for such a great nationalistic cause, that is of building, the constructing Vivekananda Rock Memorial. And same Ranade Sahab, when he went to, went for the canvassing and had a interaction with the then Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mr. Jyoti Basu. Mr. Basu himself, he too contributed, along with his wife Kamala Basu also contributed. So this is, from that day onward, I have developed a tremendous amount of resentment for Mr. Nambudripad, that what sort of politician he was. The man who could not contribute anything for the greatest Indian for last 2 centuries, then what sort of Indian he was. So, I am very sorry to say, but I developed a lot of resentment for E.S. Nambudripad, and this was the very incident that, that I intended to narrate. Thank you, sir. You have indeed thrown adequate light on a great philosophy. Now, my dear, and as our esteemed guest was saying, I'm absolutely in agreement with his very, very enlightened, erudite opinion. In one of the books which I have read many a times, Gandhi and Jinnah, wherein I found that Mahatma Gandhi was indeed not having a very, very focused mind. He kept on, deviating from his core agenda. On one occasion, he would speak about something. On the very other occasion, he would just try to nullify his own previous dictate or previous theory. So, with that sort of very vacillating mindset, Gandhi's particular thought process was not a stable one. This is my humble opinion. Sir has very correctly said and threw an adequate light on it. Sir, I am coming to a very, very important question now, because you are really illuminating our education pe charcha with all your very, very in-depth concepts. Now I'm coming to next question, sir. You are also a co-author of a history of political thought, Plato to Marx, a history of socialist thought, democracy in theory and practice, and theoretical foundations of comparative politics. Now, one by one, could you please throw the adequate light on the very first sentence, or the first heading of this book, history of Plato to Marx? How do you trace the journey, the trajectory of political evolution, right from Plato to that of Marx? Your say on this, sir.
Well, it's a long journey. It's very difficult, but I'll try to. First, I will tell about the joint authorship. In music, you have heard of Lakshmikant Pyarelal, Shankar Jayakishan. Probably in the academic world, it is rarely done. One very important reason for this is that in India, that we want to be owners and not shareholders. A very important characteristic of our life, that we are outstanding individuals, but we cannot really work in group. And Sushila, who had been my student, and incidentally, she is also a Fulbright scholar and had got good experience of teaching in Singapore. She was in Britain, you know. And I like to mention one thing, that our joint book on a history of socialist thought is mentioned along with Amartya Sen as a basic reading of socialism by a list of books prepared by Sussex University. So I could not write this book alone. I could only write it with her. And if you really ask me, she motivated me, and she did a lot of work. She is much younger than me, but then we could, really work it out, the book, and the book has stood the test of time. I remember that when the book I was looking for a publisher, and there was a man called Vasudevan. Later on, he became a close friend of ours, and he asked me how much it will sell. I said, look, I don't think it will sell much, but aapka cost aa jayega. But either way, it has 30 reprints. You have reversed the book also in between. But I would like to point out one thing, that Plato to Marx is actually a misnomer. We should have ended with Hegel, because he presided over the entire realm of political philosophy. And if you read McIntyre, you'll find that he says that all the fundamental positions of political theory is taken up by the time Hegel comes to the scene. But Marx is more popular, though Hegel is more substantive. You see, it is like popular music and classical music. So, because Marx is more popular, we included it, and later on, we also included some other thinkers to bring it to the 20th century. Now, why is political theory is important? And why should we concentrate on it? First important point, that if you read Savain's book, that's the book we read when we were young, and I still think it remains one of the basic readings of political theory. He says a very simple thing. Political theory develops as part of politics, and as there is no concluding chapter of politics, there is no conclusion to political theory. So you see the continuity with the civilization and the political process. In a way, it is a period of refinement all the time. New issues come up and new interpretations come up. And the second important point that Savain says is the link of crisis and political theory. You can have quality political theory, not in a period of tranquility, but in the period of crisis. All crisis does not lead to political theorizing. But without a crisis, you cannot have political theory. And again, here I'd like to point out, Savain gives two examples. Time of Plato and Aristotle, the great period of crisis, the relegation of city-states to history, rise of empires and nation-states, and second period in England, the 17th century, the Civil War, and the emergence of the modern state, Newtonian influence, and the starting of the period with Locke and earlier Hobbes. So that's how we try to develop in the context of political theory. And another very important point that we try to emphasize was that though political theory develops in a particular context, there is a grandeur of it, because beginning with Plato to Marx, there are larger human issues that they take up. And here I'd like to mention another great book, Wallin. You can recommend it to your friends and students. One great book, how he really emphasizes on the continuity of it and the charm of it.
Thanks a lot, sir. Sir, actually, I would like you, because the Republic has been one of the outstanding books of Plato, which gave an insight into the concept of republicanism. But most importantly, in India, as we have literally as the first republic in our own country. So don't you think that even before Plato could come up with all these ideas, India had already innovated with it? Your say on this, sir?
Well, there are civilizational contributions. And if you read Will Durant, and you will find that human evolution, civilization, is a composite evolution. Every civilization has contributed to its evolution. And we also had a great educational heritage set up, and many of it continues even today. The revival of Nalanda, I think, is a good exercise in it. But if you look to the writing of Plato, the name Republic is actually a misnomer, because it is not a book on democracy. It's an anti-democracy book. If you really look to the democratic foundation, then you have to look to the Laws and the Statesman, two other books written by Plato. But the important point from our purpose is the emphasis that Plato gives to education in the Republic. For instance, I'd like to give you just one quotation from Plato. It matters little if the state really does not do much for education. Primacy of education. And when somebody asked Rousseau that what about the Republic, he said it's not a political treatise at all. It's the best book ever written on education. So it's the education as a setup, the details of it that he deals with, the equality of sexes, and also the importance of understanding the inequalities also in education. So you will find that Plato, there is gradations. There is a particular type of evolution, and there is also elimination, and then there is a rigorous treatment, and you become educated only at the age of 35. You see, that's the rigor of his education. But I think a very important aspect of Plato that we should remember when we conceive of education, that mind you that when Plato was arguing, it was part of the Socratic tradition, and there was a competing Sophist tradition. And the difference between the Sophists and the Socratic followers are that the Sophists wanted to sell education. They will really impart education on the basis of payment. But for Plato, that is not the proper way of conducting education. Education is to be state-sponsored. And the important point that he makes is that it's the quest for truth. It's the quest for knowledge, permanent knowledge. That's one thing he says. Should provide the basis of education. So I think modern times there is a debate about privatization and how education is to be organized. I think there what we can really follow from Plato is the fact that education is to be state-sponsored. Whatever may be the role of the private sector, that should be limited in countries like India. We often give examples from the United States about the private universities and excellent ones, Ivy League colleges. But I think that's greatly a misnomer, because even in the United States, the entire edifice of quality education is provided by the state universities. And mind you, that University of California, which is a classic university system, is a state-sponsored education system. And the entire education system of Europe and East Asia are all state-sponsored. So I think in the context of countries like India, state is to play a pivotal role in promoting education, reducing inequality, and also in the context of our peculiar circumstances to bridge the gulf between the city and the village. That one of the primary focal points that Gandhi developed. So here, as I see it, that the state is to play a crucial role for the many number of years. Second important point, the binary system that India follows, that's a colonial heritage in a way, between the liberal arts and science, that I think should be given up. Vocational courses should be incorporated in the mainstream. And also, we ought to be very specific that ultimately it's the faculty that builds the universities. So faculty recruitment, faculty training, articulation, academic research in the proper sense, refereed journals, again, in a very rigorous kind of thing that the Europeans and the Americans started long ago. Now even the East Asians are imbibing, including the Chinese. Those are the directions we must go. But as Amartya Sen says, the foundational concept of modern education is primary education. And there we have faltered. We have built up IITs, but we have neglected ITTs. And that, I think, we will have to think properly and create a balance.
Sorry.
Yes, is my voice audible now?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
sir. Sorry for this interruption. Actually, I would just like to make it clear. I would just like to make it clear now, because though I'm partially in agreement with our esteemed guest, because what he says, of course, we have to be one with him, especially in the context of the sort of inequalities that prevail across India in terms of, the division between haves and have-nots. Those who are at the bottom of the social pyramid, obviously,
विवेकानंद जी आपकी आवाज चली गई.
actually, is it now? Am I audible now?
Yes, continues.
Okay. So actually, video is not coming. No issue. So basically, given the inequality that prevails across India and the sort of division between haves and have-nots, of course, those who are at the bottom of the social pyramid, as our very, very esteemed guest says, so we have to be in agreement with him that given the
Again, your audio is not.
yes, is it okay?
Yes, okay.
So I don't know why some interruption has happened. We have to ensure the stability of it. So coming to the point, am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, as I'm fully, partially in agreement with sir, our esteemed guest, that obviously given the sort of inequalities that prevail across the length and width of India, given the sort of division between haves and have-nots, those who are at the bottom of the social pyramid, hello.
Yes.
I don't know why all of a sudden this interruption has happened. So this is what I'm in agreement with him, with agreement with sir, and we just will proceed to the next question. Given the sort of interruption which has all of a sudden stopped us, we'll try to finish it as quickly as possible. So sir, this is the next question. Am I audible to you, sir?
Yes.
Professor Mukherjee, sir, am I okay?
बोलिए सुनाई दे रहा है.
विवेकानंद जी बोलिए.
Actually, it is some sort of disturbance is there. So if it is there, then we have to unfortunately conclude our program. Sir, actually, this last question.
Last questions करिए तब तक reply देंगे.
Last question, sir. Because of the disturbance, I am coming to last question. Last question to you. Why, why students prefer public administration in UPSC mains? What is the reason behind it? Because you also are an expert faculty on public administration. Your say on this, sir.
Oh, people find it more scoring. You see, actually, if I tell you that our political thought book is read more by the IAS aspirants than regular students. And that is because, you see, many of them are very bright students. You look to the number of IIT graduates who make it to the IAS or even the doctors. It's a very substantial number. And they like to acquire knowledge and the papers which they can manage. So I think public administration is a easier way in a way that it is comprehensible and it also deals with the administration. So there is really a coordination between the subject and the service, and that's how it is such a popular option.
Vivekananda ji, are you? Vivekananda ji, are you connected?
Yes, I think I'm connected, but it is fluctuating. It just, we are losing the connection, again we are coming back. So this sort of fluctuation, all of a interruption, all of a sudden it just started. Am I audible to Professor Mukherjee, sir?
Yes, I can hear you. Boliye na.
Actually, this is the last question I'm asking you, sir. That why, as a specialized faculty of political science, you feel that the theory of communism over a period of time has lost its credibility because of the Soviet crisis, where Gorbachev had was instrumental behind dismantling of communist philosophy in Soviet Union. Even the Chinese communism, which has already slumped or deteriorated to the level of totalitarianism. So communism in
मुझे लगता है फिर डिस्कनेक्ट हो गए हैं.
हाँ, डिस्कनेक्ट हो गया.
जी जी.
तो
you say on this piece, sir. Have you heard my question?
विवेकानंद जी, एक बार आप फिर से क्वेश्चन रिपीट करिए, प्लीज.
Sir, actually, what I say, over a period of time, this communism philosophy, though it is, it has its own theoretical importance, I'm not denying. But given the experience of Soviet Union, where communism, has just evaporated, and even in China, the communism has deteriorated to that of totalitarianism. So, what is your own opinion on this, the trajectory that communism has followed, and how it has lost much of its credibility? Your take on this, sir?
Well, you see, if you really look to the theory and practice, there will be divergence. But Marxism as a critical tradition will continue to be relevant. And even today's world, you'll find that in the debate of inequality, nature of democracy, and even what you mentioned is the collapse of communism, and all that is still being debated. But I'll also like to point out that universalization of democracy in the context of as we value it, there is also a large substantial number of countries which are not democratic. So we have to study that why democracy has not become universal, and we should also value and respect the judgments of nations and thinkers who disagree. And it is no small credit for the Chinese economy to become the second largest today, and will become the largest in another decade or so. And already in the context of PPP, it has surpassed United States. So I think comparative study of systems and economic development, welfare, indices require much more deeper study and appreciation rather than just comparing them superficially.
अच्छा देखता हूँ, देख।
विवेकानंद जी, आप कुछ और
हाँ,
पूछना
यस
चाहते
यस, आई गेट।
हाँ जी, बोलिए।
हाँ सर, so actually, you and actually because of some frequent interruption, sir, I am very apologetic, and I would like, Professor, I'm so very apologetic, but nevertheless, of course, it was very beneficial session. We were glad that you illuminated all our viewers with such enlightened thoughts, and of course, a few questions are still remaining, but I'm so apologetic because of the all these interruptions. I'm passing it on to Dr. Surendra Pathak to quickly recapitulate the whole interaction between me and our esteemed guest in Hindi. Sir, Dr. Surendra Pathak, please.
विवेकानंद जी, एक प्रश्न पूछ सकते हैं क्या?
हाँ, प्लीज।
ये न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी को आप किस तरीके से देख रहे हैं?
देखिए, इसके लिए तो एक सेपरेट डिस्कशन होना चाहिए, क्योंकि काफी डिटेल्स है ना। अभी नया इम्प्लीमेंट हो रहा है, तो इम्प्लीमेंटेशन हो जाए, देखते हैं। क्योंकि एजुकेशन सेक्टर में तो एक देखिए आउटले की भी प्रॉब्लम है, बहुत सारे डिटेल्स है, बट अच्छा है, न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी इज ट्राइंग टू कम टू टर्म्स विद सम ऑफ देम। बट इफ यू रियली वांट ए डिस्कशन, फिर सेपरेटली ना पढ़ के करना पड़ेगा, जस्ट सुपरफिशियली मैं नहीं करना चाहता हूँ।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद प्रोफेसर मुखर्जी,
आपने बुलाया, बहुत मेहरबानी।
जी। तो जैसा मैं थोड़ा सा समझ पाया हूँ, आपने जो भी बात अपनी रखी, जिसमें मूल रूप से आपने शिक्षा को फोकस में रख के अपने पूरे साक्षात्कार जो आपने विवेकानंद जी के साथ संवाद किया, चर्चा की, उसको प्रस्तुत किया, जिसमें आपने अपनी भी शिक्षा की यात्रा को रेखांकित किया और भारत में किस प्रकार से शिक्षा में परिवर्तन आया, कोलकाता यूनिवर्सिटी का जो महत्व था, फिर विशाखापट्टनम, इलाहाबाद और पटना यूनिवर्सिटी का आपने उल्लेख किया, और किस प्रकार से इस्लामिक स्कॉलर को बचाने के लिए अलीगढ़ यूनिवर्सिटी का भी आपने जिक्र किया। फिर आपने इस बात को भी बताया कि अमेरिका और भारत की शिक्षा में क्या अंतर है। मूल रूप से अमेरिका में जो स्टेट स्पॉन्सर्ड यूनिवर्सिटी हैं, और आपने कहा कि ऐसा ही कुछ जापान और चाइना और साथ में कुछ ईस्ट एशियन कंट्रीज में भी देखने को मिलता है, तो भारत को भी इसी रास्ते में आगे बढ़ना चाहिए। फिर आपने गांधी और मार्क्स के कंपैरिजन को रखा, विशेष रूप से शिक्षा के दृष्टिकोण से उस बात को रखा। फिर जब आपसे विवेकानंद जी ने इस प्रश्न को पूछा कि प्लेटो से लेके मार्क्स तक में आप किस तरीके से देखते हैं, तो आपने उसका उत्तर ये कह के दिया कि ये तो थोड़ा सा लंबा कठिन बात है इसको बताना, लेकिन आपने प्लेटो और रूसो ने शिक्षा को किस तरीके से महत्व दिया है अपने रिपब्लिक में, उसका उल्लेख किया। और आपने ये भी कहा कि यदि शिक्षा की गुणवत्ता बनती है तभी डेमोक्रेसी और रिपब्लिक जो है वो सक्सेसफुल होते हैं। तो इसलिए मुझे लगता है कि आपका पूरा वक्तव्य जो है शिक्षा पर केंद्रित था, और इसीलिए फिर मैंने ये प्रश्न आपसे पूछा था कि न्यू एजुकेशन पॉलिसी को आप किस तरीके से देख रहे हैं, जिसका उत्तर आपने ये दिया कि इस पे एक स्वतंत्र रूप से चर्चा की आवश्यकता है। मुझे लगता है कि आपका जो वक्तव्य है वो एकेडमिशियन के लिए, एजुकेटर्स के लिए, और जो विचारधाराओं के इतिहास को देखते हैं उन सबके लिए बहुत उपयोगी साबित होगा। इसी के साथ मैं आपको प्रणाम करते हुए इजाजत लेता हूँ। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद विवेकानंद जी।
Sir. So nice of you, my dear viewers. We have had a wonderful session. And indeed, my professor of professors, Dr. Shri Subrata Mukherjee.
I am very ordinary.
No, it's okay, sir. Dr. Shri Subrata Mukherjee, unfortunately, I do apologize once again. And that too in profusion, because, few questions are still remaining. And, actually, because of this all of a sudden interruption having taken place, sir, and since already Dr. Surendra Pathak ji has already just summed up our conversation or interaction in just in Hindi. We, we don't have words to express our deepest gratitude to our, honored guest today. Sir, on new education policy, we would also love to invite you in future for a very, very productive interaction. And since, you're such a man of oceanic depth, we'll also invite you in webinars on to educate the nation. My dear viewers, on next Saturday, we have, one of the another, giants in our own field, Mrs. Renu Singh Sarkar. She is a social activist, a very renowned lawyer, very, very renowned social activist. On our Saturday, that is again at 7 p.m. Of course, I do apologize once again before parting ways with our esteemed guest today that, it has been such a wonderful session. Alas, the session could have been extended, but because of some interruption, as we know that it is really very, very, vacillating or some sort of treacherous. It's online, despite being what you can say, an overwhelming important, or you can say a very, very pivotal platform in today's time, especially in the context or in the wake of this corona crisis. But at times, all of a sudden, interruption process, it interrupts the very session or the very program. So there was a very minor interruption, or otherwise, but that aside, today's intellectual interaction with one of the topmost professors of India has indeed been wonderful, very, very engrossing. Sir, I also salute you from the core of my heart, because you are very grace and your very dignity, which is self-explicit from your very,
very ordinary. आपने बुलाया, मैं आ गया. अच्छा कीजिए, अच्छा है.
Thanks a lot, sir. And thanks to all my viewers. Again, we meet on next Saturday at the same time at 7 p.m. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thanks to Dr. Shri Surendra Pathak.